The snow had fallen for days, turning the trail to mud and ice. Out here, a rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was the difference between life and death. But when the storm passed and the target appeared, Jack had a choice: trust the weather or trust the old rifle trick his father had taught him years ago. Before we ride into this, tell us where you're watching from, and if you love these tales from the frontier, tip your hat and subscribe for tomorrow's campfire story. The world had gone still as Jack sat atop his horse, his breath forming a cloud in the air, his hands tight around the reins. The storm had come in like a freight train, and by now it had already claimed the land a thick blanket of frozen sleet, a deadening silence. Jack was a cowboy, born and bred on the plains, but he was more than that: a hunter, a protector, and a man who knew how to respect the land. That respect extended to his rifle, a cherished old piece passed down through generations. The iron barrel was worn, but it was as dependable as the rising sun. Yet now, after days of exposure to the relentless weather, he knew the rifle's power could fade, just as his aim could falter. The trick his father had shown him all those years ago was something most men had forgotten, but Jack had never forgotten. The storm finally broke, and in the moment of that eerie calm, a figure appeared in the distance, a lone deer, unaware of the eyes upon it. Jack knew it would take every ounce of precision to make the shot count. His rifle, having been exposed to the wet, icy wind, could misfire if the barrel was clogged with moisture. But Jack wasn't like most men. He'd learned long ago how to clean a rifle in the field, an old trick that had saved more than one cowboy's life. With swift precision, Jack dismounted, reaching for his oilcloth and tin of gunpowder cleaner, a trick his father swore by. He wiped the rifle's barrel, ensuring that no trace of moisture remained. The wind howled, but Jack's mind was focused entirely on his next move. He didn't rush. The cowboy knew there was no use in pressing for a shot that wasn't guaranteed. The old trick wasn't something people usually considered. Most hunters had their guns cleaned professionally or carried the heavy burden of their rifles through the worst of the weather. But Jack's father had always said, "A rifle's worth more than gold out here. If you're too proud to care for it, you might as well leave it behind." Jack remembered that as he held the rifle steady, his finger on the trigger, his eyes narrowing to focus. With the rifle clean, Jack set it against a stone, taking a steadying breath. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "When you're out here, boy, the rifle's your lifeline. Treat it well, and it'll treat you well in return." Jack hadn't understood the full weight of those words until he had spent enough days in the wild, waiting for the right moment, fighting against the elements and his own doubt. He knew the deer wouldn't stay in one spot long. The storm had moved on, but the wetness lingered. The plains were harsh, but there was a certain beauty in the stillness that followed a storm. Jack was grateful for it. As he checked his position, ensuring that the deer hadn't wandered off, he heard a distant sound, the unmistakable squeal of the wind as it sliced through the valley. The cold bit into his skin, but it wasn't enough to make him rush. He was a man of patience. The old trick wasn't something people usually considered. Most hunters had their guns cleaned professionally or carried the heavy burden of their rifles through the worst of the weather. But Jack's father had always said, "A rifle's worth more than gold out here. If you're too proud to care for it, you might as well leave it behind." Jack remembered that as he held the rifle steady, his finger on the trigger, his eyes narrowing to focus. The trick itself was simple. When the weather turned bad, it wasn't enough to just wipe down the rifle and hope for the best. The moisture, the cold, the dirt, everything could clog up the barrel and misfire. His father had shown him how to properly clean it on the go, a trick learned from years of facing the wilderness. The cloth Jack used had been soaked in a special mix of gun oil and cleaner, something that would dry the inside of the barrel, wiping away any residue and keeping the rifle true. Jack had learned it well, and when it was done right, his rifle never failed him, not even in a storm. He watched the deer again, waiting for the right moment. His heart beat steady, his breath slow as the rifle rested against his shoulder, prepared for the shot. He had done everything right. The rifle was clean, the target still in sight. There was no hurry. The storm had passed, but the landscape still carried the weight of it. The vast open plain stretched before him, broken only by the occasional tumbleweed or the distant, lone coyote. Jack was part of this land, just as much as the wind or the rain. He could feel it in his bones, the need to act with precision, with patience, and with respect. The deer finally turned its head, offering a brief but perfect window. Jack's heart hammered against his chest as he pulled the rifle to his shoulder, his breath steadying. There was no room for error, none at all. A cowboy's honor wasn't in his skill with a horse or his fast-drawing hand, it was in the certainty that every shot he took had purpose. Jack aimed, his mind clearing of everything except the deer, the rifle, and the shot that would define this moment. The old rifle, now dry and clean, felt like an extension of himself. His father's lessons came rushing back, not as words but as instincts. Aim with your heart, not just your eye. Feel the shot before it happens. Jack closed his left eye and steadied his breath, each exhale sinking him deeper into the rhythm of the land. The wind had died, down to almost nothing, but the cold still lingered in the air, biting at his skin. The rifle's cold steel was familiar against his cheek, the trigger smooth under his finger. A minute passed, maybe two. The deer was unaware, chewing at the grass, its head low, and its body framed perfectly in the crosshairs. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. A small twitch in the deer's ear was the only sign it had felt something stir, but it didn't move. His shot would need to be quick and clean, no hesitating. He'd only have one chance, and Jack was too seasoned to miss. The moment arrived. The shot rang out, a sharp crack in the stillness, louder than any echo of thunder. For a heartbeat, everything held still. Jack didn't dare lower the rifle until he saw the deer stumble, its legs giving out beneath it. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hand stayed steady, the rifle still perched against his shoulder. The deer fell slowly, its body crumpling in the tall grass, a silent testament to Jack's aim. He exhaled, lowering the rifle as the adrenaline started to fade. The task wasn't over, not yet. He had to gather the deer, secure his kill, and then return to camp. But the moment of the shot was what mattered most. He had done what few could. In this wild, unforgiving land, he had taken a life with respect, precision, and patience. As Jack dismounted and walked toward the deer, the wind picked up again, its howl returning like the storm had never left. The plain stretched before him, vast and endless. He didn't hurry. This was the way of the cowboy, the work, the silence, the waiting, and the moments when it all came together. The walk to the fallen deer was slow, methodical. Jack never took for granted the life he had just claimed. As he reached the animal, his eyes swept the land around him. There were no distractions out here, just the endless horizon, the snow, and the beating heart of the wild. This was what made a man. This was survival. And survival was always earned, never given. The deer's body lay still, the ground around it disturbed by its final moments. Jack kneeled beside it, running a hand over its sleek fur. He knew that every kill was a sacrifice, that the land and its creatures had their own way of taking their toll. But Jack wasn't some careless hunter who reveled in the slaughter. No, he was a man who understood the responsibility that came with each shot. He had been taught by his father, a man who had lived by a code that didn't just involve surviving the frontier, but respecting it. Every animal, every piece of land, every moment in this unforgiving world was part of the same whole. Jack stood and looked around again. The storm had passed, leaving only the cold remnants of its fury. The plains were vast, silent, like the land was holding its breath after the violence. He could hear the faint rustling of wind through the few barren trees that dotted the range, the way it sang a song of the land's raw, unyielding power. He had no intention of leaving the kill here for coyotes or other predators to feast on. His father had taught him to take care of what he claimed, no matter how long it took. Jack moved swiftly to work, skinning the deer with practiced hands, the same way his father had shown him when he was a boy. There was no rush. There never was. A cowboy's work was like the land, steady, deliberate, requiring a patience that few understood. The cold seeped into his bones as he worked, but Jack didn't mind it. Out here, The cold was just another part of the environment. It was the harshness that made a man tough, that shaped him into something more than just flesh and bone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Jack had finished his task. The meat was carefully bundled, and the hide was wrapped tight to protect it from the elements. He paused for a moment to look at the rifle again, now resting beside the deer's body. It had served him well, true and clean. His father's old trick had worked, just as it always did. There was something deeply satisfying about the precision, the certainty that had followed the shot. It wasn't just about hitting the mark. It was about the preparation, the care, and the respect for the weapon, for the land, and for the life taken. As Jack packed up his things and prepared to head back to camp, a strange thought crossed his mind. How many men had let their rifles rust and their patience fail them? How many had trusted in sheer luck, thinking that the wild would always bend to their will? It was a dangerous mindset, one that Jack had never subscribed to. Survival wasn't about brute strength or speed. It was about understanding the land and the lessons it had to teach. The ride back to camp was uneventful, the quiet of the plains settling into a comforting lull. The wind had picked up again, but Jack welcomed it. The sound of the wind in the trees, the scent of snow on the air, a long stretch of trail ahead, this was his world. One built on the slow and steady rhythm of the land where each step was earned. As Jack rode into camp, the world around him seemed to breathe in rhythm with his horse's steady steps. The warmth of the fire he'd left behind called to him, but he didn't rush. His thoughts were quiet, distant, as the day's work began to settle in the spaces between his bones. The rifle rested in its place beside him, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He hadn't missed. He'd done everything right, and yet in the solitude of the open plains, that wasn't the part that mattered most. It never was. The wind had picked up, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had swept through earlier. The howl of it had been relentless, like the land itself, trying to speak. Jack had learned to listen, to feel the subtle changes in the air that others might miss. It was this quiet knowledge of the land that separated a man like him from those who would perish out here, who might grow impatient and hasty. The fire crackled as he dismounted, his horse nuzzling at the grass nearby. Jack set to work, unhitching the deer from the saddle and securing it beside the campfire. The glow of the flames painted the nearby rocks in shades of orange and gold. For a moment the world felt small, confined to the flicker of the firelight and the warmth it offered. Jack felt the weight of the day's ride begin to leave his shoulders as he worked. There was no rush. There never was. The deer's body was already cooling in the night air, and Jack moved slowly, methodically, just as he had when he'd field-dressed it. His hands were steady, accustomed to the work, each movement purposeful and precise. Out here, on the frontier, every action had its meaning. Every step was a part of the dance between life and death, survival and failure. The quiet of the night wrapped around him like an old coat, familiar and reassuring. He could hear the wind, moaning in the distance, pushing through the trees as the sky darkened. Above, the stars began to shine, one by one, like small pinpricks in the fabric of the universe. Jack glanced up for a moment, letting his gaze linger on the heavens. This was his world, the wide-open range, the endless plains that stretched out to the horizon. It was a world that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful, but Jack had learned to tread lightly. As the fire crackled and the meat cooked slowly on the spit, Jack allowed himself a moment of reflection. His mind wandered to his father, his quiet, steady father, who had taught him everything worth knowing. Every lesson had been a gift, and every moment of silence had held meaning. There was no rush, no hurry. Patience was the key to survival. In the wilderness, in the world of cowboys and outlaws, a man who could wait was a man who would live. Jack never considered himself special. He was just another cowboy out here, doing his job, living the way men like him had lived for generations. But there was a sense of pride in his work, in the quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. His rifle had been cleaned, the shot had been true, and the day had been his. As the last of the fire died down, Jack stretched out on his bedroll beneath the wide, open sky. The world was quiet now. the only sound the wind and the soft breath of his horse. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, and more lessons to learn. But for now, Jack allowed himself the luxury of sleep, the quiet comfort that only the frontier could provide.